usual, and I'm one of the point persons for Noche. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Noche is part of the year-long celebration of the Department of Philosophy. Noche is a reading group. The entire name actually is Noche Alegre, a twist of Noche Triste from the University of Old. So it's a reading group that we have planned to focus on specific readings representative of the different research thrusts of the Department of Philosophy. So for this session, the reading is on East-West comparative philosophy, which is one of the five research agenda of the department. And without further ado, we can start. Well, the title of the essay is Nishitani on emptiness and historical consciousness. But just for a brief background, well, the author of this essay, it's not really Nishitani Keiji, but it's Chen-Kuo Lin. So let me just read this very short bio that I put. He's a professor emeritus and chair of the Center for Buddhist Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the National Chengchi University. He's a distinguished professor in both the Department of Philosophy and the Graduate Institute of Religious Studies at the National Chengchi University. He earned his PhD from Temple University in 1991. His research interests include Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist logic, epistemology, Chinese philosophy, particularly Neo-Confucianism and Taoism, and also comparative philosophy. But the person on our poster was Nishitani Keiji. And well, to begin perhaps the essay, we could start with, sorry, we could already begin with who Nishitani is. This essay is really like a review of Nishitani's main ideas. So Nishitani Keiji is one of the three landmark thinkers of the Kyoto school, obviously in Japan. They lived during a period, well, following the Meiji Restoration. For those of you who are familiar with the history of Japan, for centuries, Japan was close to the Western world until there came the time of U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry knocking on the door of Japan. And that's how the caricature is, but it's more like they had guns pointed at Japan. Like, if you don't open up, then we'll just come in. However, James Heisig, he's one of the leading professors today about who writes about the Kyoto School. He says during this time of the Meiji Restoration, or leading up the Meiji Restoration, prior to the advent of the Kyoto School, Japan already was at the verge of opening up. It only just Matthew Perry was that tipping point for Japan to really open up itself to the Western world, and realizing how secluded they were. Japan being Japan, they immediately sent scores of scholars to Europe to study everything from natural science to history to literature, especially philosophy. So in less than a century, the brilliance of these Japanese thinkers was that they were able to come up with their own school of thought. This is the Kyoto school. They were able to come up with their own school of thought. And as I mentioned earlier, Nishitani Keiji is one of the three. So we have Nishitani Keiji, Tanabe Hajime, and the very first one is Nishida Kitaro. So we have three thinkers. Okay, so one of the main works of Nishitani is Religion and Nothingness. And personally, I like this. I like this book because he talks about nothingness, and as you've read perhaps in the essay, his philosophy has a very strong affinity to Nietzsche's. A question that normally comes up is that did these Kyoto school thinkers simply adapted Western philosophy to the Japanese intellectual climate, or did they simply just bring in what they had? Well, no. James Heisig again would say that they just were able to incorporate different elements. So from their own background, they're able to incorporate different elements to come up. I mean, in coming up with their own school. Okay, so maybe at least that's a good background for us to understand this better. So I think we may begin. Um, Maybe we could start with this section. So about the Kyoto School, they did not simply talk in vain. On the contrary, they were not only clearly aware of the inseparability of politics, history, and culture, they also attempted to prophesy a political and cultural alternative to European modernity. Well, how I get from what I get from this is that during this time, I mean 1900s onwards, the question of modernity really was something that people could not simply ignore. And as I mentioned, these thinkers did not simply translate European thoughts into the Japanese climate, but they prompted the same questions within their own framework or within their own cultural consciousness. And yeah, I mean, could we really separate politics, history, and culture? For them, it wasn't really an easy thing to separate. That's why it's today, if we look back at their writings, they really advocated to an extent imperialism, Japanese imperialism. And that's even mentioned later here. So it's not really for them. I mean, that's the Asian view, more or less. That's how we read it. Politics, history, culture. It's not really something that we could simply separate. And more so, if we start talking about subjectivity, religion, we cannot. There's no. I mean, there's no clear demarcation between politics, let's say, on the one hand, and religion on the other. Consciousness, subjectivity. So for them, they tried to talk about these things together. Um, if someone would just want to raise a point or something, please feel free. So in this section, again, we are reviewed of some of the ideas of Nishitani Keiji's essay on overcoming modernity. So first, in this essay, Nishitani diagnosed the crisis of European modernity as a process of disintegration. As Nishitani pointed out, a similar crisis of modernity is characterized by cultural disintegration had already occurred in early modern European history. Three trends of European history, that is Reformation and the rise of natural science, represented three respective sectors of culture, namely humanities, religion, and science. These sectors became mutually independent and conflicting with each other without a fundamental unifying ground. The Christianity of Reformation viewed human beings as mere existence of sin and mortality, in contrast to the absolute power of God. This is Lutheranism. On the other side, natural science regarded the whole world, including human beings, as ruled by mathematical and physical laws only, while the Renaissance's humanism affirmed human nature that manifests in sensation and reason. The immanent harmony among God, world, and soul in the Western tradition, or among heaven, earth, and human beings in the East Asian tradition, uh, Tien, Dien, Ren, for those of you familiar with Confucianism, was completely lost in the modern age. This disintegration is considered the deep cause for the crisis of modernity. The pathology of modernity was also reflected in the socio-political, ideological conflict of individualism, nationalism, and cosmopolitanism that arose in parallel with the disintegration of individual, state, and world. As a consequence, the self-understanding of human beings becomes completely disintegrated and fragmentary. So this is the first point about the crisis of modernity. Secondly, it is a religious crisis because of Christianity's incompatibility with humanism and natural science. This, again, in relation to the difference that Nishitani points out between the the Renaissance, the Reformation, and and the third, the rise of natural science. So it's a religious crisis because Christianity is not able to it's incompatible with humanism and natural science. In this regard, Nietzsche's God is dead is nothing but a declaration of fact. For Nishitani, it does not mean that the only solution is to embrace scientism. On the contrary, he appeals to the Buddhist notion of the subjectivity of nothingness, arguing that it can serve as the ontological ground of modern religiosity. So this was what I mentioned earlier, that for them they really tried to integrate their own backgrounds into their philosophical ventures. We know Buddhism thrives in Japan, not primarily from India, but it went through China first. So we have the Mahayana Buddhism and then Chan Buddhism in China, and then it leaped to Japan, and it's called now Zen Buddhism. So the idea of nothingness uh, really comes from Taoist influence on Chan Buddhism. But we should not. I mean, it's not simply just saying that Mahayana, or sorry, that no self of Buddhism is already the Tao. I mean, those are two different things. But at least that's Nishitani's perspective on it. That okay, there is a religious crisis, but maybe it would be better understood, society that is, or culture would be better understood if we could embrace this Buddhist notion of nothingness, of the subjectivity of nothingness. Yes po, Doc.
Gandang gabi, Anton. Gandang gabi sa lahat. While reading this part and listening to your overview and parang background inputs, I was just wondering whether yung sinasabi ni Nishitani, yung the consequences of modernity might be the same for East and West. No? At least base sa dalawang paragraphs na to. That's what he's trying to say. Pero ang tanong ko, and you or any member of the group might want to answer this, especially those who are well-versed with East-West philosophy. Yung kayang features of modernity in, kundi man, when I say features, yung constitutive elements of modernity, pareho din kaya sa East and West? Is the kind of modernity that Nishitani is talking about that he or Japan confronted, similar din kaya yun dun sa the kind of modernity that we often talk about in the West? So, just a question.
Actually, Doc, parang yung this is similar po to our conversation before, yung our experience, yung Filipino experience po, kunwari, our experience of modernity. Parang we're trying, di ba, we had that conversation na parang we're trying to jump forward to post-modernity and something similar to that. Japan actually had, Japan really went through that rush. Kasi yung during the Meiji Restoration, the emperor, since kasi restoration po siya ng power ng emperor, the emperor said, we have to learn everything. We have to learn everything. So from, I mentioned earlier, scientists to philosophers to historians to poets, nagkaroon on the one hand ng parang depreciation of Japanese culture. Kasi parang napaka-superior ng West compared sa Japan. But because of that, later on, kaya na-fuel din yung idea po ng patriotism or ng nationalism. And the idea, as later on, it would be mentioned, yung expansionism na, teka no, hindi pala tayo inferior. Nagkaroon po ng recognition na because of our ideas of yung pure land Buddhism, because of Zen Buddhism, because of Shintoism, and of course, yung influences ng Confucianism and Taoism, meron tayong taglay na atin, na pwede nating dapat natin ipamala sa ibang tao. That's why doon naging fuel po para ng expansionism. I would say yung idea ng modernity is precisely the European idea of modernity. Kasi they try to really bring that into Japan po. Yes po, Doc. After Doc, si Amabel po.
Thank you for joining us, Amabel. I'll just say a few words before uh, we listen to you. That's what I'm trying to say, no? Parang on one hand, it is easy to speak of modernity as though merong universal experience of modernity, di ba? Uh, as you pointed out a while ago na this has been parang part of our constant conversation. Yung yung modernity sa Pilipinas, we 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 often appropriate modernity dito sa atin. Pero yung modernity sa atin parang yung biya negatiba ng modernity. Uh, yung we experience it precisely because it is absent, or we experience it precisely because ang nararanasan natin ay yung sorry outcomes of modernity. At yung kay Nishitani, parang the way I read his account of modernity, parang yung modernity niya ay comes, uh, hindi siya parang phenomenon from the West. Eh. Yung modernity that he's talking about precisely comes from Japan's resistance to modernity. Parang ganon. Yung pero meron mga hindi maiiwasang consequences. Eh. Like for example, he was talking about yung nationalism as a potential response to modernity. At yung nationalism na sinasabi niya ay parang as a kind of protective stance or a defensive stance against modernity. Pero what is interesting is that sa Europe, yung modernity likewise bred nationalism. The best example, di ba, in Germany? Tatak ng modernity sa Germany yung nationalism. Pero what is interesting is that when this modernity is transported elsewhere outside Europe, it breeds the same thing. Yun yung sinasabi ni Nishitani. And if you look at the Philippine experience, it's also the same. When at least our initial encounter with modernity in the 1900s, it yielded the same political and cultural experience, yung nationalism. Ang pagkakaiba nga lang, I may be wrong about this observation, pero ang nakikita kong pagkakaiba is that sa Europe, yung modernity that brought about nationalism likewise led to the formation of the state. Pero sa nationalism sa Japan, yung nationalism na yon hindi nag-led sa formation of the state kundi strengthening of the empire. Yung tama yung pagkakaiba ng East-West. Sa Pilipinas, yung modernity na yon na nag-breed in nationalism led neither to the formation of the state or the intensification of the empire, but to the fragmentation of our politics na hanggang ngayon nararamdaman natin. So, just a question and a few thoughts, and then maybe others can contribute. Tigil muna ako rin, and then I turn the floor to Amabel.
Thank you po, Doc. Amabel.
Hello, good evening po. So, as a response to Sir Jovi's question about kung anong modernity yung, I think, Nishitani is specifying. So, from what I understand, Nishitani was particularly tackling the that arose during the modernity. So, for
Sorry,
Nishitani,
medyo nag-choppy dun.
ay,
Ibang
sorry.
sense.
So, yung type of dualist thinking that arose because of modernity, which is nga that stemmed up from Descartes, yung when he divided the subject, object, and yung mga, and then as a consequence ng dualist type of thinking na there's a divide or a fragmented view of the self and the other as well. So ayun, that was what Nishitani was trying to counter or was trying to respond to dun sa naging problem ng modernity. And as a result of that, nabuo I think yung concept ng nihilism or nihility, which was viewed in a negative sense. But using or from understanding Nishitani from the point of view of Buddhism, Nishitani was saying that this nothingness or this nihilism is actually a positive thing. Kasi when you say nihilism, di ba, it kind of connotes a negative type of impression. Pero using emptiness in Buddhism, type of dualist thinking is why there's a problem now kung saan-saan na like what you have mentioned na different problems that arose because of that. And so, he said that although mamaya i-discuss ko din naman pero sige dito na rin para clear. Nishitani was saying na yun nga because of modern thinking dualist mode and na-disregard yung nothingness as kind of a negative understanding or impression about sa reality, parang doon na nagkagulo-gulo. And yun yung pinaka-tinatakal ni Nishitani. So in short, his problem was, so siguro one of his problems from the way I understand it, was the dualist um, way of thinking ng modernity. So ayun lang po.
Okay, thank you, Mabel. Gab?
Ayun, yes po. So, going back to the question of yung sa trend, as stated in the article, no, the three trends of European history, particularly with yung the crisis of modernity, we can draw parallels pa rin, even if meron siyang distinct na Eastern or even Japanese na na insight. Pero yung difference kasi niya as I see it from yung crisis of modernity discussed from the West and discussed from the East. Usually, when we think about the crisis of modernity, one of the schools of thought na madidiscuss natin is the Frankfurt School, which is usually when they ponder upon modernity, they would appropriate it or they would talk about positivism, scientism, and new forms of domination. Pero as stated nga kanina na when we discuss it from Nishitani's piece, kasi he's drawing from yung tradition ni Kitaro Nishida, which was yung I think advisor niya or at least yung founder ng Kyoto School of Philosophy. And since Nishida kasi instead of merely rejecting yung Cartesian dualism and adapting mga previous traditions, wala silang distinction between affirmation and negation. Similar as opposed to Hegel na merong distinction between thesis and antithesis. So, nagre-reflect din yon with regards dun sa modernity nila. And later on, as madidiscuss siguro, yung solution nila between yung freedom of the world and freedom in the world na combination siya ng ontic and ontological subjectivity. Pero going back dun sa crisis of modernity niya, na I would say na yun yung difference nila na in the context of the West, usually when we talk about modernity, meron siyang discourse about yung domination aspect ng reason as a way of or something manifested in colonization. Pero as for the East, it's not simply colonization, pero meron siyang as stated dun sa article na disintegration of yung or yung wala ng immanent harmony between God, world, and soul. So, yun lang naman po. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gab. Let me just first pick up dun sa huling sinabi ni Gab, yung God, world, and human person. Parenthetically, that's actually the way of the tower. They would say that yung alignment nung TND rin. God, world, and the human person, which parenthetically coincides with Kant, right? I mean, you have the three antinomies, the three transcendentals rather. You have God, world, and self, God, world, and soul rather. But yung sa question ni Doc Jovi, I think po Doc, yung when you say yung difference, kasi napaisip ako doon, in the West, modernity progressed in a in a very linear way. So I mean, yung for example, yung different stages ng revolutions or yung industrialization. So we have yung, that's why if we recount history, parang it's very easy if we always point our fingers to the west. Okay, first ganyan, the next stage ganyan. But in the east and well, everything not west, in that idea, uh, our modernity, our experience of modernity was something quite different because, I mean, for obvious reasons of colonization, or I mean, just to focus dito sa Japan, in such a short span, they had to learn everything. They had to learn so much. Yung so it kumbaga nawala yung progression, that linear concept of time. And I think it's also for that reason that's why time for Nishitani is quite important, and he mentions it later in this essay. Well, it is mentioned in this essay. Kasi yung understanding of time really as that linear progress, it's something very easy if in society that is also mirrored. But it's something different. I mean, for example, ipagsasabay-sabay lahat. How do we understand time? And this is where like other ideas in the East are quite beneficial. I mean, the idea of samsara, let's say, or there is a return, or and this is where Christianity is really able to fit in, at least in our history, and as recounted by Professor Ileto, na there is an afterlife. So parang merong pa ring semblance of a linear way, pero parang what I'm doing now contributes to the future. So it's not really that smooth transition, as you know, from humanism from Renaissance to Reformation to natural science. Na parang Habermas would say it's in secularization of society, and Professor Lee mentions that here. And I think yun po, Doc, yung parang you injected so much of time, na in the West it took centuries. Dito sa East, or in particular sa Japan, in such a short span, kailangan matuto kayo niyan. Kailangan matutunan natin ito. I think that would be my response. My take on that. Okay. Walang mag-add. I mean, a nice exchange. So how do we overcome modernity? As parang what Amabel mentioned, overcoming modernity, how Nishida would explain, really require that attentiveness or that sensitivity to nothingness. I mean, that's why sa Kyoto School then it's a common thing to have references to literature, especially to basho poems. Kasi yung that type of sensitivity to nothingness. I mean, for compared to sonnets of Shakespeare, let's say, or I mean, all of the poems that we've learned na may mga ganyan. And then we read a basho poem, na parang 2-liner lang or 3-liner lang. No, 3-liner, di ba? What's that? But that meditation, or nothingness, is something really part of Nishida's way to overcome. Nishitani's way to overcome modernity, he would say. Gab, would you want to mention more about itong ontological and ontic difference?
Pwede naman po if that's okay. Pero I'll be making references to being in time since dun siya derived. Ayun. So with regards to sa ontic and ontological subjectivity, since na-discuss ni Nishitana and they're drawing on, well, not only German idealism but also Heidegger's philosophy on being and time particularly. Maganda nga yung religion and nothingness. So medyo nagdo-draw siya dun sa mga yung title ng Being and Nothingness from Sartre. Pero going back, ontological subjectivity and ontic subjectivity. Ang difference niya is, as stated dito, is that yung ontic subjectivity is something that is real, concrete, as opposed to ontological subjectivity na hindi lang siya classified as something na abstraction. Pero meron kasing dalawang chapter si Heidegger on the ontological priority and then the ontic priority. So as Heidegger explained dun sa ontological priority, na hindi lang siya basta grounded on or ontic ontic subjectivity, na hindi lang siya grounded na real lang siya, pero grounded siya dapat sa um, ontological subjectivity, which is echoed by Nishitani rin dito, na particularly the ontological subjectivity or the subjectivity of nothingness, or the ontic subjectivity is based on the subjectivity of nothingness. So pero ang difference dito, as opposed to pitting them together, na ontological subjectivity versus ontic subjectivity, medyo na-combine niya yung dalawang subjectivity na yon, particularly dun sa political philosophy niya or political thought niya, that in order to have the universal mind, kailangan mag-go beyond the individual mind. So, it could be a reflection niya na going beyond yung Heideggerian distinction between ontic and ontologic, in order to apply it and concretize yung thought na yon into political thought. So, yun lang naman po mostly.
Okay, thank you for that, Gab. Yun nga, so we have a difference. At least the second point is that the difference between ontic and ontological subjectivity, which would naturally flow into yung third point of the essay, which is the difference between freedom from the world attained by ontological subjectivity, which again, this is a subjectivity based on nothingness, and should be transformed to the freedom in the world as obtained by ontic subjectivity. So the former is called freedom beyond the world, while the latter is called freedom within the world. Nishitani argues that although freedom beyond the world is made possible in Christianity, both freedom beyond the world and freedom within the world can only be fully realized by the subjectivity of nothingness. As I just finished this paragraph. As Nishitani further comments, true liberalism should be qualified by the realization of freedom in the twofold sense, both ontic and ontological. By the same token, liberalism in the Anglo-Saxon tradition is criticized for its one-sidedness, namely lack of freedom beyond the world. Sige po, Doc.
I just would like to share my 2 cents doon sa distinction between ontic and ontological subjectivity. And then, as usual, the other members of the group can validate this thought. Yes, there is a distinction, and sabi nga ni Gab na not only Nishitani, like Heidegger as well, especially Heidegger, tsaka Buddhism provides such distinction. Pero the way I gather it, it's not as if there are 2 kinds of subjectivities. Yung bang 2 kinds na parang
parang dalawang damit na
parang dalawa. Oo, na parang autonomous subjectivities. What I gather from it is these are distinctions that refer to or point out yung ating constant tendencies, yung ating constant vacillations between one moment we are ontological subject and then the other moment ontic subject tayo. Ewan ko, isa rin siguro siya sa consequences of modernity, na yung bang ambivalent consequences of modernity, na on one hand, yung modernity made us more aware of our ability to be a cogito, pero at the same time, yung cogito na yun ay dissimulated. To refer to our book launch 2 days ago, parang nandito yung constant struggle ba, and constant temptation to be an identitarian thinker and at the same time metaphorical thinker, and we are always caught in between. You are in a way a critical thinker or a metaphorical thinker or an ethical thinker is someone who can afford to be conscious of that possibility or of that tension of his within his own thinking. Eh, ang problema, yun nga eh, we don't always have that ability. We don't always have that readiness to recognize yung ganong fracturedness of our own thinking. Most of the time talagang nasa cogito lang tayo eh. Yung ini-insist lang talaga natin yung what we think of something without realizing na ito palang klaseng ideyang ito, yung klaseng opinion na to is more ontic than ontological. Siguro katulad nga ni Sir Pao, Nishida is highlighting yung bang challenge for us to recognize that ambivalence, that vacillation. And I don't think hindi siguro to overcome it, but to constantly be on guard. So doon muna.
Thank you po, Doc Jovi. Okay, Doc Pao po.
Salamat. Can you hear me?
Opo, medyo may konting static lang po.
Wait a minute. Yeah, sige, papalit ako yung mic because I was just trying to use another mic. Magpapalit ako. So, sige, you give the others a chance, pero I'd like to talk also.
Sige po, Doc. Kasi with what Doc Jovi just mentioned, I would just want to read this part. For Nishitani, the subjectivity of nothingness, ontological, can be attained only through the negation or the casting off of the Cartesian subject, the ontic, of mind and body, while the mind-body relationship will be dialectically affirmed again on the ground of the subjectivity of nothingness. Okay, so it's against that backdrop we're talking. Sige po, Doc.
How about now?
Much better po, Doc.
All right. So thank you, Anton, and good evening to everybody. Good evening, Jovi. Binanggit ka narinig ko yung pangalan ko eh. Hindi na sana ako magsasalita.
Good evening, sir.
Salamat. Ay, good evening pala. Pero now it has something to do with this is just a follow up to Jovi's or a follow through to Jovi's discussion or comment about the difference between ontic and ontological. There is a tendency, I think, especially with people who read Heidegger. Kasi, di ba, in Heidegger, especially in Being in Time, there's the distinction between the Dasein and the Dasman. And people seem to associate Dasein with ontology and Dasman with ontic, which is, I think, fundamentally misleading because, as I understand it, ontic and ontological are for Heidegger, as at least the way I understand Heidegger, ontic and ontological are merely ways of talking about the world, two different ways of talking about the world. So, in other words, we're talking about, we could say that we're talking about one in the same world, but we can talk about it or relate to it either ontically or ontologically. So when you say ontic, it doesn't mean that you are not being authentic. Ontic simply means that we are to use to use a trope from the book launch again. Ontic is where you find yourself in the middle. And you don't need to be a philosopher to be able to find yourself in the middle or to experience, for instance, suffering. One of the things that perhaps I wanted to illustrate, not only in the book that we launched a couple of days ago, but in some of my writings also is that uh, uh, as philosophers we seem to think, and because I mean, talking about two ways of talking about the world, there's the ontic and the ontological. As philosophers we seem to assume the language of ontology. The problem with that is that when you assume the language of ontology, you have this presumption, which I think is precisely wrong, presumption that you have control over what you are talking about. Forgetting the fact that, as a matter of fact, even philosophy, even ontology, finds itself in the middle. Uh, and so, therefore, as philosophers, we are not, as a matter of fact, we are not in the position, let's say, to talk about justice or to talk about suffering, precisely because we assume that ontological slash privileged position. We forget that we forget that we start philosophizing at the middle. We start thinking at the middle. And so Jovi also mentioned earlier that yung sabi niya na yung baka nga kailangan nating i-revive yung or i-revise rather yung we have to revise our understanding of the ontic, right? Because yun nga, there's a tendency to distinguish the two in privilege ontology, and in a way there's a tendency to demonize the ontic. Well, going beyond Heidegger, I think if we now, if I'm going to use at least an insight from Adorno, it is precisely the ontic that makes ontology possible. And to put that in more Adornoian terms, it is it has been the theme of the book launch that we had. It is our experience of suffering that informs the way we think, and that experience hopefully will lead us to a development of ethical sensibility. So as opposed therefore to relegating the ontic to or associating it with inauthenticity and so on, as I would say rather that it should be the reverse. It's the ontic that is prior to ontology, and ontology it's just that is the privilege language of philosophy. Although in Adorno, he does talk about the ontology of the wrong state of things. But, talking about the wrong state of things from a philosophical vantage point, that's when we theorize, the problem of, let's say, violence or the wrong state of things nga, of damaged life, of oppression and violence, of injustice. Yes, we need to talk about injustice or damaged life from the standpoint of philosophy, from the standpoint of ontology. But at the same time, the realization that the language itself that we are using does not and that doesn't have the power really to resolve what we are trying to solve. It's just a way of talking about it and probably opening up possibilities. But it is not in the position. The philosopher is not in the position to talk about injustice. The figure of Heidegger is important. One of the reasons why critical theory, specifically Adorno, was very critical of Heidegger, because precisely to some for some time Heidegger forgot that he was in the middle. he took the privileged position. And para bang ang sinasabi ni Adorno, well, in that sense then, a philosopher does not have or rather, as philosophers, we are not in the position to talk about injustice. Not unless we go down and find ourselves in the middle. Okay, sorry Anton, sorry everyone for that. Na ano lang ako, na-inspire lang ako dun sa intervention ni Jovi. So, salamat Jovi. Pasensya na.
Thank you for Doc Pao. No, for those of you who don't know, we had a book launch the other day of Doc Pao's book, and his latest book entitled Nietzsche and Adorno on Philosophical Praxis, Language and Reconciliation Toward an Ethics of Thinking. It's available on Amazon for those of you who are curious. Wala lang, just a plug.
But actually, there's a 30% discount if you if you buy it through the publisher. But let me know. I can share the flyer with a 30% discount code.
So thank you for that, Doc Pao. Just a rejoinder. I think the idea, I mean, the trajectory of the Kyoto School at least, and of Kyoto School in general, and Nishitani in particular, is not per se an overcoming, but to borrow the term of Professor Muller, he used undercoming. Because parang that's the idea of the negation here. I mean, it's in this next sentence. Such dialectical affirmation is predicated on the logic that absolute negation is, and with reference to the word soku, absolute affirmation. So it's not that clear distinction between affirmation and negation that we have. I mean, following that Western understanding of you have oppositional pairs and stuff like that. But it's precisely refusing to to engage in that type of opposition. Why should my understanding of reality be dichotomized between affirmation and negation? Just to use again everything that we've been talking about, I find myself precisely in the middle, and these categories are imposed to me by myself. It's a self-imposed category that hinders a true experience of nature. It's from that vantage that a subjectivity of nothingness arises, as not a nothingness of negativity, but a nothingness that allows us to experience. Um, it's as if we're saying that. Well, I would want to put it this way, since I mentioned shirts earlier. Uh, Affirmation and negation are simply two shirts that I just put on, but it's not real. It's not the main thing, I mean, the most important thing in life. I find myself precisely in the middle, and not and these concepts just lead me to one direction or to another. These concepts, in fact, hinder me from really experiencing what's in the middle, experiencing reality. That's why he wants to, at least he points to the idea of casting off that dualism between subject and object, or mind and body, or whatever way you want to put it, and see, in fact, how the two are dialectically affirmed because of that space we have in the middle, which these thinkers, I mean, in the Kyoto school, would want to simply say, would want to simply call nothingness. So it's a nothingness that allows us to experience these concepts, allows us to experience everything in life. In fact, Nishida Kitaro, because this is Nishitani, so Nishida Kitaro, he talks about pure experience. Well, his early project was on pure experience, dwelling on that. So within this nothingness, if I dwell, very Heideggerian, because these people really studied Heidegger, Bergson, and a lot of one of them really was a student of Heidegger. I'm not sure if it's Nishitani or Nishida. Anyway, but if I could dwell in this nothingness, that's pure experience. But later on, he abandoned that for a different reason. Yeah. Okay, so I think that was quite fruitful for this section, and I think that's good for us to move over to the next point. because fear mind, the idea here of fear mind is that which brings them to a political expansion in this thing. But I don't really want to talk about that because maybe some of you don't really know Japanese philosophy, tapos that would affect our reading of it. Okay, maybe we could now proceed po to Amabel. Amabel would want to say a couple of things about this third part.
Hello ulit. So, I'll be sharing my reading of this section. So, a disclaimer lang, di ko naintindihan to lahat talaga. Lalo with the comparative of, kasi minention niya din dito sila Husserl and then sila Heidegger. But I'll do my best to tell you at least the summary and some key points here. So this section, the emptiness and historicity in Nishitani's religion and nothingness. So this section of the essay elaborates on Nishitani's work, which is yung religion and nothingness. So this is where Nishitani puts forward nothingness or emptiness or in Buddhist term sunyata as the real form of reality. So if we recall how the Westerners would claim that, and I think we're all familiar with this phrase, no, that something cannot come from nothing. But Nishitani takes this nothingness as contrary to that, no, as the fundamental notion in rational explanations of the Eastern experience in human life. So you see here, there's a difference between how the Western views nothingness as a kind of meaningless and perhaps a threat, and they view it in the form of nihilism or nihility, in the sense that, like I mentioned a while ago, it connotes something negative. But for Nishitani, coming from the Eastern or Buddhist perspective in particular, he provides another perspective of nothingness or emptiness or sunyata, which is understood in the Buddhist sense. So nothingness as sunyata, however, is not something that's outside of our existence. So nothingness, if we understand it in the Buddhist perspective, is not separate from being but is always in a relationship or is always intertwined with being. So I think what Nishitani was trying to point out was that the problem is instead of grounding all the reality in a singular unity, the Western approach, because of the modernity, divided and separated reality into this subject object or in the dualist way of thinking. So, the way I understand it, Nishitani was responding again to the Western concept of nothingness as a kind of, yun nga, a threat. But from the Buddhist perspective, no, for Nishitani, this nothingness or emptiness should be viewed in a positive sense. It's not a threat, no, it's simply the reality or the ground of all things. But we just couldn't comprehend it because we view reality in a dualist perspective. So here, Nishitani highlights that being and nothingness are intertwined. But this is something that we cannot understand if we use the speculative reason that we are uh, used to. So he uses the Zen Buddhism, or he's coming from the Zen Buddhist tone, where in sorry page 497, Chen Chen-Kuo Lin explains that Nishitani draws from a methodological distinction between existential phenomenological thinking and conceptual representational thinking, while refuting that the latter or this conceptual representational thinking is inauthentic mode of thinking. So Nishitani takes the existential phenomenological thinking as his own hermeneutical standpoint. But Nishitani elaborates his own hermeneutical method explicitly in the Buddhist tone. So here Nishitani uses again that method that which consists, or I quote, consists in man's grasp of his own finitude on a dimension of transcendence, and so to speak, that breaks through the standpoint of discursive understanding and speculative reason to the depth of his own existence. So it's like how the Zen Buddhist view reason as irrational. Well, irrational not in the sense that it defies reason, but because it finds reason as too limiting, too constricting, and inadequate to grasp the truth. So from the Zen Buddhist perspective, they believe in a direct grasp of truth that is not attained through reason or any type of intellectual analysis, but more of an intuitive grasp of reality. So, in other words, Shen was trying to explain to us that Nishitani's existential phenomenology should be understood in the context of the Buddhist practice. So in the same page, we find his passage. Now, as soon as one has cast off the dualistic frame of subject and object, mind and body, one is able to see things as they are. And on the contrary, reason enables one to see things as representations only. So in relation to Nishitani's discussion of history, both Nietzsche and Heidegger dealt with the problem of nihilism um, as the problem of the history of being. And on page 500, Chen-Kuo states that Nishitani interprets nothing as the field of nihility on which great liberation becomes possible. And that is when one comes to realize that all is empty, including time, history, and all that. So in this sense, in page 500 po ulit, nihility is not a nihilistic concept. As Nagarjuna argued, emptiness is the groundless ground of being, and everything is established by virtue of emptiness. And if there were no emptiness, nothing would be established. So, as I have said a while ago, Nishitani takes this, at least from what I understand po, so feel free to correct me if I'm mistaken. So, Nishitani takes this nothingness as the fundamental principle of everything, of reality, in contrast with grounding reality with something. No, he uses nothingness as the ground of everything. So instead of recognizing the ground of reality in a singular unity, the Western approach divided reality into a dualist mode of thinking. So, and in the following sections, I think Nishitani's views about Christianity, modernity, and Nietzsche are further elaborated. So, ayun lang po pinaka-summary ng pagkakaintindi ko sa section na yun. So, thank you po for listening.
Thank you, Amabel. At least that was a very precise elaboration, at least on that section. I mean, it's yung idea ng transdescendence. So instead of transcendence, Nishitani would in fact use transdescendence to explain yung kasi we have those two different camps of phenomenology, right? Yung existential and yung representational, representing Heidegger and Husserl respectively. And it's obvious, I mean, who they follow. So they follow Heidegger. However, they, as Amabel pointed out to us, they give this twist, and Nishitani in particular talks about how the Buddhist notion of emptiness allows us, as I mentioned earlier, to transcend reality, to refuse to engage in those concepts. For me to allow me to really experience reality as something quite different. Uh, and he follows Dogen. Dogen is a Buddhist monk, 10th, 11th century. Uh, he follows Nishitani follows Dogen in in the Buddhist practices, because these people in the Kyoto school, while they are really academics, while they're really professional, like philosophers, if we would want to call them that way, at the same time they're deeply religious people, and their idea of religion is quite different maybe from how we understand religion. That, I would just go to, well, not that's not really how I understand religion, okay, but I mean, for example, like some people just simply say that, well, religion is just me going to church on a Sunday and then me living my life for the rest of the week. But for them, no, because they did not see they did not see like contrasting elements in practicing, let's say, Zen Buddhism, but at the same time, an element of Shintoism. And that plurality of the religious experience allow them to really imbibe that tradition of of silence, of dropping experience, of casting off. I mean, words like these uh, to make them really make them experience the idea of pure experience. But I would just want to point out something. I mean, because it'd be a shame if we would miss it. Uh, Jan van Bragh's translation of Yu Wei. Jan van Bragh is the translator of Religion and Nothingness. He translates Yu Wei into being at doing, and Professor Lin points it out that, I mean, when Heidegger, or at least the West, if we say being, that would, how we understand it, Nishitani would say, is precisely being at doing. Time is understood, or time is understood in reference to a particular activity. So being in time, or Dasein, he also like goes beyond the distinction Heidegger makes and says, even Dasein to an extent is unable to grasp the radicality, if I could use the term, of nothingness. Because being in time is being at doing. You being, and then way is activity or doing. So it's an active being. Byung-Chul Han would talk about the vita activa, I mean, bastardized by neoliberalism. And I think quite similarly, Nishitani talks about Yue, or being at doing, within the same lines. Not entirely about neoliberalism or capitalism, but precisely our preoccupation with concepts, our preoccupation with, with distinctions, with these differences, instead of experiencing life in total. Would someone want to add or comment, raise a point about that? Mm, that also would lead to the next page. Here, the idea also of time. So in Nishitani's analysis, the meaning of time in its primordial sense is twofold: newness and impermanence. Time in the sense of newness is possible because all things as new things are constantly arising in dependence upon other cause and conditions. This sense of newness is to be viewed either as creative possibility or as infinite burden. Although Nishitani places much emphasis on time as burden, this is Lin, rather tend to think that the true point lies right at the possibility of conversion from the burdensome state of time to the creative state through spiritual practice. The 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 Buddhist influence really here. At this juncture, the question arises: how is existential conversion possible? In reply, Nishitani mentions two. The first is that the infinite drive is always already at work. The second is that time contains at its ground the presence of infinite openness. Um, there's some people also doing work between Nishitani, Nietzsche, as mentioned earlier, but also Nishitani and Bergson, Nishitani and Deleuze, because of that play of antinomies. That is something very spectacular for us following the Western tradition. But I mean, and this was written, let's say, just at the turn of the 1900s. They were talking this way, and then it lasted until, I mean, the ends of their life. So yeah, so obviously Nishitani has Heidegger's notion of project or Entwerfen in mind when he proposes these explanations. However, the possibility of existential conversion is still not fully clear. If we turn to Buddhist thinking, as what Amabel mentioned, Madhmika in particular, we find the answer right in the doctrine of dependent origination. That is, since all beings are originated in dependence upon other causes, they are empty of intrinsic nature in themselves. I'll just finish the sentence. And since there is no permanent and changeless intrinsic nature at all, change is possible in directions of either becoming burdensome or free. And so that's really where nothingness becomes really important. Yes, po, Doc Jovi.
Thank you, Anton. I just would like to solicit your uh, opinion siguro, as well as the opinion of other members of the group doon sa ginagawa nga ni Nishitani na when confronted with modernity, for example, sa West, the response is to heighten yung divide or isolation between reason and religion. Uh, para bang the only way to rescue civilization is to make sure that the two won't meet. Parang ganon. Pero kanishitani, parang kakaiba yung he's trying to repair yung damaged relation between the two. In fact, yung sinasabi mong nothingness or the subjectivity of nothingness is, if you read carefully what he's trying to say, is an outcome precisely of that para bang reconciliation between subjectivity and religion. So, dun lang muna. Like I said, I just would like to solicit your remarks and those of others dun sa particular aspect na yun of Nishitani's thought.
Thank you po, Doc Jovi. That's actually a nice point. Na some people are, I mean, especially in our tradition, we would think it that way in how, let's say, Habermas recounts things. Today, it just anecdotally, I mean, Nishitani, Nishida, and Tanabe, so the three thinkers of the Kyoto School, besides others, they're studied more in the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture than in the Kyoto University. Kasi what happened in the Kyoto University was they started to read these people na parang textbook na lang. So okay, you have Nishida Kitaro, blah 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 blah. You have Nishitani Keiji, blah 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 blah. And then you have Tanabe Hajime, blah 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 blah. Ang nangyari is, bakit pa hindi nagkaroon ng fourth generation talaga na malinaw? It's because we started, and this is James Heisig, we started to parang compartmentalize these people wherein they themselves refused such a distinction. That's why nag-flourish yung Kyoto School, or at least these philosophers, reading these philosophers of the Kyoto School, it flourished in the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture, where James Heisig is a permanent researcher, besides others. Kasi parang sinabi niyo po, hindi pwede mag-usad kung hihiwalayin, kasi yun na nga yung nangyari sa modernidad. Hindi mag-uusad kung patuloy pa rin na ganun yung ginagawa. And I think that's how Nishitani would I mean, that's why Nishitani recounts that difference from the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of the natural science. Kasi for him, sorry, medyo masarap yung dinner namin. For him, lahat yun, they should all go together. They should all go together. That's why I mentioned earlier, it's really easy to draw affinities between him and, let's say, Bergson with the Elan Vital, or him and some people are doing Niklas Luhmann. Also, just a last thing before maybe someone else would want to add, it's also for this reason that Sloterdijk would talk about the future of globalization as that re-understanding of, and this is in his book Infinite Mobilization, Euro-Taoism. He mentions it. It's not the English name of the English title of the book is Infinite Mobilization, but the German title is Euro-Taoismus, Euro-Taoism. And he mentions in the preface, kasi I cannot think of any other term eh. Yung mali ng Europe, nakikita naman na natin yung parang yung sagot sa East, sa Taoism. He uses Taoism as the example. But he uses Taoism in a more broad term. But he is referring to that combination precisely of, let's say, religion and culture, or state and church, just to use imageries we're familiar with. Because of nothingness. Because of, this is not Sloterdijk anymore, this is now the Kyoto School. because of nothingness. Tayo na lang naglagay nung parang categories, pero para mas makausad, maganda na hindi na paghihiwalay. I think that will be my contribution to that. Would someone else want to add to the conversation? Very exciting. Ay, ano ko si Aljulitas? It's nice kasi it's something quite unique in the sense na it shares yung Asian heritage, yung we share with them, yung Asian heritage. But at the same time, it's something familiar to us because of the West. Yung ganon. Kaya ang gandang basahin sila. Okay na. Sige. Okay, kung if at any moment, if any of you would want to say something or want to share, and just raise your hand, or I could see quicker kung if you just raise your hand para just share your insights. Siguro we could move now to this fourth part, the critique of modern historical consciousness. I'm sorry, sino yung nasa first part? I forgot. Sino ba yung dyan sa ating...
think
Okay, fourth,
si
Anyo?
Sir Fourth, yes.
Yes, okay. Sige, fourth, please.
Oh, good evening to everyone. So, on my part in this one, I've read mostly to that of the subsection 4.1 as emailed by Sir Anton. So, for the 4.1, okay, I made for a reflection for both being aware of the condition of the crisis and my understanding as a response of Nishitani on the problem. Okay, on to the subsection 4.1, historical consciousness in Christianity. From what I've understood from the readings, okay, there are some structures I came across for reflections, such as the feature of Christian historical consciousness on about okay, the consciousness of freedom via the consciousness of sin, having a human freedom, yet we are enslaved by our transgression, Christianity overall. And it boils down to the second feature that I've understood, which is the character of self-centeredness. Okay. And in that value or characteristics of self-centeredness from that of K.G. Nishitani's perspective, a culture of self-centeredness has developed of the inability of many people to move beyond a sense of nihilism in their lives. That is why I think the second crisis of modernity interpreted by Nishitani is that of the incapacity of Christianity to serve the needs of modern culture, a religious crisis indeed. In this, there is a need to make sense, or maybe what you are to understand on what nihilism is, because nihilism can be of the increasing factor of self-centeredness, or somehow the self-absorption of humankind, if you will. And at the same time, devaluing humanity and engendering an attitude of meaninglessness. Okay? And as a response, and what I've understood, maybe one way or another, from Nishitani to that of Nishitani to nihilism is Buddhist-Christian dialogue. Sa mga Buddhist-Christian dialogue. Setting not merely an interfaith dialogue, but more so a coming together against this nihilism or religiosity. And maybe a calling of the need of interreligious perspective, so much so not only we are to tackle harmony between cultures, but more so to address the problem of modernity. So dealing this interruption of nihilism, I think of both religions, both Buddhists coming from that of the one that Nishitani has highlighted that much, and to that of this perspective of Christianity, to which we can have a discussion of common human experience nga naman. So such experience of meaninglessness, I think this experience of meaninglessness can be found to Buddhists as well, to that of the Christians, and they can provide a ground to which to begin an interreligious dialogue. So as a conclusion to what I've understood on the given topic, the subsection, let me draw out the dialogue between Christians and Buddhists. the need for submission of the self that manifests itself in one's loving relationship with others. Somehow, a thought of a selfless love that will transcend such nihilism or meaninglessness. That I think is my sharing regarding of the subsections on the historical consciousness of in Christianity, together with a response of Nishitani.
Okay, thank you for that, Thor. Thank you for giving your thoughts on Nishitani's critique of Christianity. Well, I would say for us to have an idea, I mean, parang it's a bit strong kasi his criticism of Christianity. He's influenced by Nietzsche. So, I think dun pa lang. Alam na natin. He's influenced by Nietzsche, and they were really, itong Kyoto School, they admire to an extent Nietzsche's philosophy. Uh, because of, and of course, we understand here the Christianity, or I would want to understand it here, the Christianity that Nishitani would critique or would identify in Nietzsche's critique is that self-serving type of religion. And we could, I would say, we could substitute the word Christianity. I mean, he uses it as a placeholder for the idea of a self-serving religion. Na, let me do this for my own good. I would sometimes use this example so students ko na, why do I help the poor? Is it because I just simply want to enter heaven, or is it really because they need help? Kasi if we would have that first answer na, I would enter heaven, edi, tinulungan ko lang sarili ko. That goes contrary, especially to, for example, Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative. Kaya nga, I mean, so human self-consciousness is constituted in a consciousness of sin. Again, the Christianity also that he has in mind here is in that progression. So you have the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of natural sciences. So Lutheranism, Lutheranism, the idea that, well, we're simply sinful, we're simply by nature sinful beings, and salvation is attained only through Christ. That idea na wala akong magagawa to reach my salvation, or wala akong magagawa, I mean, besides, beyond Christ's grace or the grace of God. That type of religion is what Nishitani here, as mentioned before, would really want to critique. So besides yung ganong view of the human person, it's the role of salvation within history. Again, yung linear passage ng time. Eh. So, okay, life, death, and then the afterlife. So much talk of eschatology, of things supernatural. Ironically, still they fall under that time, or that progression, so to speak. Maybe this would spark some conversations because we're nearing the end. Because I mean, it's also the idea of Gerard Fink. Maybe if those of you who are familiar, instead of using kingdom of God, he would rather say the reign of God. It's not something solely at the end, but that's why we say your kingdom come. We do it here on earth as it is in heaven. Kasi kung solely, if we simply follow yung idea ng always at the end, so that form of teleology, what difference is that? Again, the Nietzschean influence. What difference is that from, let's say, bourgeois culture or from neoliberalism? So right. I've been mentioning this before. Yung the similarities between Christianity and yung when Nietzsche talks about the German, what it means to be German or Aryan and the bourgeois. So because these three for Nietzsche would simply talk about the end rather than the arduous process. In like manner, Nishitani follows that and recognizes something dangerous or wrong in it. Yeah. Would someone to add? Medyo hirap pag east-west no? Konti ang napag-uusapan natin. Okay. Well, kasi may emergency yung naka-assign dito sa 4.2 and sa 4.4. Well, it's pretty common kung kailan you have assignments. So that's when people suddenly can come. Although they confirmed just like a few minutes ago. So this idea of 4.2, sorry for that. The idea here, this is 4.2, is simply, I mean, he continues the Nietzsche thing. And in particular, so here for Christianity, the meaning of history comes from God's will. For modern man, the meaning of history comes from human reason and progress. Such belief in the meaningfulness of history has been considered the core of modern Western culture until God is dead was declared by Nietzsche as a sign of nihilism. Maybe I would bring back what Doc Jovi mentioned earlier about the separation of, let's say, uh, religion and um, history or culture. On the other hand, uh, yung idea or let me just, for it to sound a bit the bankruptcy of modernity is that we gave different brands to the same thing, in the sense that, okay, on the one hand, and Nishitani would point to this, okay, the meaning of history comes from God's will, but on the other hand, it just comes as other tradition, the meaning of history comes from human reason and progress. So we have the Renaissance, you have human reason and progress, you have the Reformation, it comes from God's will, and then the rise of natural science, yung Darwinism, the idea that the meaning of history comes from that natural selection. Um, the illusion of modern historical consciousness is mainly rooted in human reason as self-will or will to will or self-attachment in the Buddhist sense. So this illusion of the difference of the differences between these traditions is simply rooted in that self-centeredness that plague modernity, that plague Western modernity. We understand that already. That's why he would recourse again, as Amabel mentioned earlier, and as Gab mentioned earlier, to that sunyata of the Buddhist tradition. For Nishitani, only in the field of emptiness can the solipsism of Kantian subject be broken, and the other we recognize as being with Mitsein of Heidegger. In the ontological, so this is the negative, and the religious sense. So here, I mean, this I think would bring our discussion from earlier back, because would bring both that discussion of subjectivity as nothingness on the one hand and religion on the other. So only through that field of emptiness can we break free from that cogito of Descartes for Nishitani, or for Kant the primacy of reason, and be broken, and the other be recognized as being with, as Mitsein, in the ontological and religious sense. However, the danger, and Professor Lin points this out, in Nishitani's idea, although we already find some gems in it, is that Nishitani pushes this line of thinking to the extreme, asking for, he quotes, a complete conversion from the standpoint where the self is an autotelic person to the standpoint where the self is a means for all other things. End of quote. Nishitani repeatedly emphasizes radical self-negation, even to the extent that, he quotes, the self as person, including even its reason and will, the self such as it is in its totality, has to become a thing to all other beings. End of quote. To take self as a means but not as an end is the complete realization of religious love, or agape, or compassion, karuna, in this world. It is precisely at this point we see the hidden danger in Nishitani's critique of modernity. If a person chooses to sacrifice him or herself as a means or a thing for others, the value based on such a choice still belongs to the subject as an autonomous being who is able to judge and make decisions. What if, conversely, she chooses to sacrifice other selves as a means or a thing, when a self is no more viewed as a means in itself? The dangerous consequence of Nishitani's critique of Kantian ethics should not be taken lightly. Obviously, this idea might be somehow related to his wartime political involvement, so we cannot discredit that. However, again, that danger is that I could disregard myself solely for, that experience of nothingness, or or in a social sense, for the experience of being with another person. However, we're not breaking free if we talk about that from the teleological argument still of the end gaining enormous value, which is precisely his critique of modern European culture. Anyone? Okay, dito sa 4.3, I think si Jim, di ba?
Yes, good,
Jim.
good
Okay.
evening.
Congratulations by the way, Jim, sa MA.
Thank you po. Thank you, Sir Anton. So I will just read the first paragraph, then input my reflection afterwards in order to link with this section to the next subsection. So point 43, historical consciousness in Nietzsche's nihilism. The most impressive contribution in Nishitani's lifelong philosophical journey is seen in his brilliant appropriation of Nietzsche's radical nihilism as a bridge for utilizing the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness to meet the crisis of modernity. For Nishitani, the best way of understanding both the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness and Nietzsche's nihilism is allowing them to illuminate each other. It might be legitimate at this point to say that Nishitani's philosophy would not strike us so profoundly if it had not been mediated through his reading of Nietzsche. And I will just give my input. So that I think the negation of the self in Zen Buddhism's notion of the non-self or the no-self, which is expressed in Nishitani's emptiness, is at the same time an affirmation of something fundamental. So something fundamental that we are able only to capture in nothingness. So this emptiness is not a kind of nihilism per se, but a kind of detachment for based on my observation. So it is a kind of detachment, as you pointed out a while ago, Sir Anton, a kind of transcendence. It is an emptying of oneself or of our valuation, our sensibility with life, or our way of thinking. And at this juncture, I find Nishitani's affinity with Nietzsche's notion of overcoming, that we must not be complacent with ourselves. We must constantly break the idols that we have created for ourselves to overcome our mediocrities. We must empty our consciousness, which have been filled with us by the sick culture of modernity. So in short, we must be emptied in order to be filled anew, like what Dr. Bolaños emphasizes in his blue book. We must undergo a deidification as well as a naturalization in order to have a fresh sensibility of reality. So we must ground ourselves once again to reality. So what is the implication of this to historical consciousness or to history in general? So we must again reevaluate history. I think this is an invitation to reevaluate history because in the East, history is fixated to the salvific history in terms of religion. So I think we must reevaluate history. So history must not only be an account of events or happening with regards to the salvific history, but the history of lived experience. So, yun lang po.
Thank you, Jim. Doc Pao, both books na ano na ngayong gabi. Uh, so
should I say something?
may plug na naman yung book niyo.
Congratulations lang kay Jim, natapos na pala siya.
Thank you,
Congratulations.
Doc Pao.
Jim.
Thank you po.
So I mean, it was really Nietzschean. What Jim mentioned to us. I really don't have to add anything to it. Maybe I'll just point out itong just to add lang to the conversation. Itong last part. Instead of being disclosed as the manifestation of eschatology or the field of progress. Mind you, again, the title of this essay is Nishitani on emptiness and historical consciousness. On the one, he talks about emptiness in sunyata, void, I mean, all the things we've been talking about, no self. But on the other hand, his mention of time is for his discussion, Professor Lin's discussion on historical consciousness. Okay, So emptiness and historical consciousness. Instead of being disclosed as the manifestation of eschatology or the field of progress, history is now disclosed as eternal recurrence of the same by the will to power. I think you can't get any more Nietzschean than that. Heidegger, because you have the same here. Eternal recurrence appears here as an utterly pure and transparent becoming, which is envisioned only by the will to power at the moment of the present. It is at the ground of the present that one comes to experience the eternal recurrence as nihility, and pure becoming. That's a rather odd combination, right? Nihility and pure becoming. It is also at the ground of the present that the fundamental conversion from the great death, death of life, death of God, death of culture, death of the creative spirit, to great life is possible. A great life. The mention, I mean, what we mentioned earlier, the difference between how history becomes, to use a Nietzschean image. I mean, we bear history like a camel, like the camel that rushes into the desert, to from the great death to the great life of the child. So this is part of the three metamorphoses. The child that is reborn, the child that is means the return of joy, so from great death to great life, is possible under the sway of the will to power. It is the will that reveals the eternal recurrence as pure and innocent play. If there is history, it should be viewed in such a way. History become why? Because history becomes meaningless because the truth of metaphysics is now claimed to be nothing but a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. Parang we have lost sight of the main goal. We have become weary, as what Jim mentioned, to be human. So that human all too human ill fate is precisely the death of immanence, the death of pure experience. Okay, so itong 4.4, let me just read this first paragraph. Although the thought of Nietzsche seems to come pretty close to Zen Buddhism, Nishitani still follows Heidegger's interpretation to consider Nietzsche as the last metaphysician who constructs a system of metaphysics in terms of will to power as essence and eternal recurrence as existence. Hence, according to Nishitani's Kyohan, or the classification of teachings, Nietzsche's position on nihilism is not radical enough for deconstruction of metaphysics, for will is still conceived as the essence of being. Kasi yung will to power as essence. Furthermore, unlike the Buddhist standpoint of emptiness, Nietzsche's standpoint of will is still somehow characterized by self-centeredness that lacks the other-oriented compassion. So the failure that Nishitani sees in Nietzsche is that inability still to go beyond that framework that Heidegger reads in Nietzsche. According to Nishitani, Nietzsche's will to power needs to be supplemented by bodhisattva, compassion, and superseded by the standpoint of emptiness. Maybe I could just read a few more sentences. The standpoint of emptiness is the radical deliverance from self-centeredness. Western conceptions of time and history are rooted in the metaphysical notion of a self-centered will. This is especially manifested in human reason in modern secularism, the will of God in Christianity, and the will to power in Nietzsche's atheism. Or we could say this self-centered will, as we've already discussed earlier, is made manifest or is found in human reason in the humanism of the Renaissance, the will of God in the Reformation, and the championship of the championing rather of the theory of natural selection, i.e., the will to power in natural sciences. In order to discharge the authentic temporality of time and the authentic historicity of history, Nishitani argues the self-centeredness of will needs to be completely negated and transformed into the standpoint of emptiness, that transcendence, that undercoming, as I would say. Only with such conversion of standpoint can past karma accumulated by acts of the will be wiped away. Still, I mean, it's the way Professor Lin writes this. It's we still verge on yung religious tone na yun. Again, just to refresh us, karma here is in reference sa Buddhism, means sa samsara. So good karma is only attained by not doing bad things. So still the idea of nothingness. So only with such conversion of standpoint can past karma, which is accumulated by what I've done, by the acts of the will, only through this standpoint of emptiness can all of those be wiped away, because they're inessential in life. And such a kind of enlightenment experience of life world, this is actually something that I really appreciate, because he uses this, and also other Kyoto school thinkers with, I mean, it's very obvious, some degree of similarity to Habermas's writings. Life world is often depicted in Zen poems cited by Dogen. Every morning, the sun ascends in the east. Every night, the moon descends in the west. Clouds retreat, the mountain bones are barred, rain passes, the surrounding hills are low. The Zen poem cited here illustrates the authentic historicity of history that is found in our fundamental experience of daily life, without any concealment of discursive and representational thinking. So it's for this reason, and I would say it was what was most practical for them. These thinkers, and Nishitani in particular, follow Heidegger's branch or method or way of phenomenology because of that existential import. However, they try to go under, to still use the same word, undercoming. They try to go under the distinctions made by these phenomenologists, and would instead posit a return to pure experience, a return to a mindful meditation of mindlessness. Very paradoxical, I know, pero that's the only way I could um, um, uh, say it, rather. Okay, before we move to the concluding remarks, would someone want to add something, or their own observations or sharings about it?
Anton?
Yes po, Doc Rochi. Sige po.
Oo, pasensya na ha. Makaano lang.
Sige po, sige po.
Oo, teka. Pasensya na kasi inabutan ko yung second part na lumabas ako eh. Anyway, hindi ko nabasa. I have to be candid, no? Pero hindi ko maano yung tawag dan. I can't resist not to share. I will just react based on the exchange. Ang ganda ng exchange eh. Yun. Hindi ko nabasa. Natabunan kasi ako ng ontic responsibilities ng GS accreditation at saka yung mga conferences namin na virtual kanina. So I found myself in literal
Okay, exercise in nothingness yan.
Ayan na nga. Kaya I found myself in literal nothingness kasi kanina may virtual ganto, ganyan. Yan kako, ano bang ginagawa ko dito?
Pag-assistant din, marami talagang ginagawa.
Ay, nako.
Pag-secgen marami ginagawa.
Hindi, naapektuhan na nga yung sa research. Anyway, parang naalala ko yung si Roland Barthes. Meron siya na yung Empire of Science yata, parang ganyan. Na book in which parang pagpunta niya ng Japan, yan, kita niya ang daming, hindi siya marunong magsalita ng Japanese, and there are so many symbols, significations, only that the signified is not in any relation connected with the signifier, parang ganyan. Alimbawa yung the emperor o yung castle na nasa sentro, sinasabing seat ng nasa sentro siya pero nothing siya kasi wala naman siyang silbi, 'di ba? Emperor diyan actually parang there's a government, but yeah, there's an emperor pero wala naman siyang lakas. Ginagalang siya pero anong tawag doon? Symbolical, just like many other monarchs we have today. So I think the nothingness is there, but it's there. Ang ano pa doon, striking is that it's at the center. No, nasa sentro siya. yung castle, geographically and so on. Yan, no? Ika nga niya, napakaraming signs, ngunit wala namang signified. Yan. So, gusto ko relate dun sa sinasabi nila, Sir Pao, kanina, no? Tsaka dun sa book launch. I really appreciate that the tension in between extremes at the middle. Kasi very Kierkegaardian, sorry yun yung bias ko. Teka, comment muna ako. No? Yung kanina kay Kuya Joby, sabi niya yung sa East and West philosophy. Ito ang ganda nung manifestation. Kaya lang, let me also share sa Philippines, although we belong sa East, parang lumalabas yung modernity, nagsimula lang nung 20th century. In a sense na yung religion and philosophy, parang nag-start nga lang sa atin yung medieval ages nung 15th century, natapos lang. I don't know, you may disagree with me, baka 1960s lang nung dumating na itong sila.
Baka in 50 years matatapos na.
Yan. So, yeah. Parang hindi ko ma-connect dun nga no, sa pangyayari sa Japan and modernity, enlightenment. Yan, no. So very late na 'yun nangyari sa atin, no, in huge part of it in my interpretation. I believe mga 1960s na lang tayo nag-question ng medieval imposition on religion, theology, philosophy, which until now hugely influencing politics and by far law and economics. Ano ba yung kanina? Yung lately lang, no, Supreme Court yata nagsabi na there's no way magkaroon ng marriage of the same sex kasi it's unconstitutional, something like that, no? Malalim yung foundation and very much so nakaano sa religion. Yan, no? So balikan ko yung middle. Ang ganda nung yung middle yung konsepto. Religion in the East, no? The ontic ontological, tama yung I fully agree, no, yung kay Sir Pa, kay Joby na Heidegger himself calls those two not as entirely distinction, independent, but they are modes of being. Yan, modes of being. So gawin mo to, it's your choice. Gawin mo maging authentic or inauthentic, there's no one will judge you. It's just a mode of being for you. Ang dami nga nun di ba? Yun yung may mga hypen. No? So they are modes of being. Existential yata, no? Tawag. So in the same way, sa Pilipinas, kita ko, na ano ko, bigla lang nagpapap sa isip ko kanina, we are also in between. Medyo ako sa popular religiosity. Doon makita mo, no, I'm a sinner, but at the same time, I'm a politician, but at the same time, I'm also maka-Diyos, no, nagdo-donate, and so on, no. Napoles, how many times yung Nazareno pala napupunta sa bahay niya, something like that, no. It depends on you know. So ambivalence, no, as early as 60s nabanggit na yan nila, ano yan yung split level Christianity, I forgot yung SJ, yung psychologist, no. Anyway, so I may be a sinner, but I have a capacity also to be noble, and we can see this in popular religiosity. Yan, so the middle, the subjectivity is there sa palagay ko, no. Nabanggit nyo kanina, so many cases, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Ricord. Naku, nandyan si Jim Lester. Congratulations, Yan. And of course, Kierkegaard via his pseudonymous authorship. The play, the tension of the extremes. I agree very much dun sa kay Sir Pau's contention dun sa kanyang sharing sa book launch, na. Yan, hindi ko pa naano yung libro Balita ko meron yatang gift sa inaanak, no? Parang meron yatang copy, no? Ko-confirm ko pa, Anton, with Ninong Pao, no? Anyway, all these things are happening all together spontaneously. Ngayon, gusto ko naman yung aking comment on hermeneutic point, pangalawang point ko, no? kasi hindi ko alam talaga yung philosophical underpinnings, but based from your exchange, geographically, historically, Filipinos are melting pot, no, of church and state. Nabanggit nyo kanina, east and west. May nagbabanggit ng sakop, pantayong pananaw, and all these things are possible at the same time. No? Wala tayong masyadong distinction between the two. Hermeneutics, bakit ko nabanggit? Sa Japan kasi nung, Jesuit Dominican missionaries in the 15th, no, hanggang mid-17th century, itong mga Jesuit Dominicans na to who turned to become martyr saints, no? They were never welcome in Japan. The Christianity, yung parang mga Tokugawa era, no, yung mga ganyan, no? Because of perpetuity ng kanilang threat sila dun sa family. Lalo na nung nagbibigay na ng mga territorial lands dito sa mga missionaries. Kaya yun, no? Parang 2,000 yata ang namatay, no, na mga naton. So I believe again, hindi ko masyado alam, no. Nishitani is convenient, no, to compare East and West accounts of Christian religion in a philosophical sense. Behind this, palagi ko, shoot dito sa mga historical things that was happening. Kaya parang shoot na shoot siya, no, itong the in between is very much actually like modernity and nihilism and Christianity. I think kung titingnan natin yung kasaysayan ng Japan, ito yun eh. Kaya shoot na shoot, kumbaga, kung ilalapat itong philosophical interpretation of this sa kanilang history. In terms of geographic, ano ba yung may climate, no? Time, maganda usapin kanina yung time eh. Kasi kung makita mo sa Japan, just like other countries, pero sa Japan napaka dramatic nung seasons. Yan, no? Kaya it keep on changing. It keep on changing and changing, and it's hellish like, no, lalo na pag winter, malamig, but it's a burden. So the time there is a burden, yung kaninang binabanggit nyo, no? And yet people need to be adapted to it and need to be appropriated, no, as part of life, as some kind of eternal recurrence na yung season na yun. Nakakainis na nakakatuwa, no, na paulit-ulit, but you have to do it, you have to live with it, no. Historical siya. Ito yung time, no, yung kaninang consciousness sa binabanggit nyo, yet it's empty. Since it goes round and round and round, paulit-ulit. Kaya ang tendency, para kang ma-burn out, paulit-ulit. Yun, mahilig ang mga existentialist sa mga drama na ganyan, no? But you see, you have to live with it because it's part of your ontic nature. Yan. There's nothing you can do but to live with it. This in many aspects, makikita mo ito sa kanilang art, yung mga haiku, sa culture, no, and even oral stories, tsaka yung everyday conversation nila, no, pag nakausap mo yung mga tao, time for them, no, is there, paulit-ulit, so we can consider it as a burden, a kind of an emptiness, but through time also provides yung kaninang meron diyang citations, no, give birth, yung sunset, no, sunrise, and so on, no? New beginning, and then afterwards mamamatay, and so on. So I think, no, pasok na pasok yung filosofiya, no, na Nishitani, reading these things vis-a-vis the factual, historical, geographical ng Japan. Yan. I don't know if I make sense. Yun lang, no? Yun yung pumasok sa isip ko when you were having exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you po for that, Doc Rochi. Doc Pao?
Thank you. A very short comment. Not really comment, more of a clarification regarding the ontic and the ontological. The way I understand it is more than modes of being. There are modes of, kasi pagka you interpret them or you refer to them as modes of being, parang there is this you create the distinction between one mode of being compared to a better mode of being. Kaya nga the unnecessary distinction or the unnecessary privilege given to ontology over ontic. And I think that happens in Heidegger, in the jargon itself of Heideggerian philosophy, which we could actually say that Heidegger did not intend. Um, for me, it's better to refer to ontic and ontology as ways of talking, no? Ways of talking about the world, or even ways of understanding the world. As a matter of fact, all of us live in the ontic world or the ontic sphere. Everything happens in the ontic sphere because that's where we find ourselves in the middle, in the ontic. Our appreciation, however, of that experience of realizing that we are living in the middle could evolve into uh, philosophy or ontology. So ontology is not really a privileged language. It's just another way of talking about, or another way of talking about the ontic. So I think yung a relationship is not really a relationship of mutual exclusivity between ontic and ontology. It's more of actually they are dialectical in a way because there's no ontology without the ontic. We always go back to the ontic. No? That's why after teaching, after this discussion, no, which is highly philosophical, we go back to what? Most of us will go back to Netflix, watching Netflix. Most of us will go back to sleeping, brushing our teeth, drinking, eating, and so on. All those, however, you cannot necessarily say that they are inauthentic modes of living, because that's how everybody lives that way. Making sense of it, though, is another thing. Then when we make sense of the ontic, when we give significance to it, then we start doing philosophy, or even religion, no? Even theology. Kasi I agree that in some cultures there are no strong distinctions between these things. And I think this is precisely what we are learning from the reading this evening. No? However, regardless of what we think about philosophy, philosophy is not really a privileged position, because it has the language of philosophy has a tendency precisely to forget the ontic, right? To forget suffering, for example, to forget our concrete lived experience. Kasi that's another word for ontic, lived experience. So thank you, Rochi. Thank you, Anton. Rochi, yung regalo from Ninong. Dapat meron munang regalo from the inaanak.
Ganun ba, sir? Sige. Kaliwaan, sir. Kaliwa.
Kape. Hindi, biro lang. Tignan natin, kasi actually ako, I don't have enough.
Magkano, sir? If I magkano ang magkano daw?
Well, it's $95. One copy is $95.
Kayang-kaya
I
nitong
think that's
project.
3,000 yata.
Bili ka na lang kay Mrs.
Oo nga, pabili ka kay ano.
Hintayin natin yung flyers ni Sir Pao. Sayang din yun, ano?
Hindi, may flyer. Pinadala ko na yung flyers before. Actually, it's in the Facebook page. You can use that if you want.
Sige, sir.
Tingnan natin kasi ako mismo, I cannot really buy in bulk kasi imagine maski na may authors ano ako, malaki-laki pa rin. So we'll see how it pagka makachamba ako. Tingnan natin.
Good, sir. Salamat, Sir Pao. Salamat, Anton. Thank you.
Thank you po, thank you. Lagi naman nandiyan ang blessings para sa makashare ng. Okay,
bukas ba? Well, what
OR,
blessings?
yung OR.
By the way, bukas ba ang blessings?
Bukas po, Dok.
Bukas.
Apo.
Talaga? Tingnan natin. Baka
Makakuha tayong copy agad. Sige, thank you po for that. Siguro just to end, I would just want to highlight, maganda yung sinabi ni, yung may isang binanggit si Doc Rochi na it's a very nice way to end it kasi the idea of here, let me just read this. The historical time of Dasein as being at doing, Yue, is firmly rooted in the trans-historical emptiness as non-doing or unconditionedness. Conversely, the trans-historical emptiness needs to be realized in historical time. Maybe yung response si Doc Pao kay Doc Rochi puts the two together. The trans-historical emptiness needs to be realized in the historical time. This is the fundamental spirit of the Bodhisattva path, where each point of historical time pieces through the field of emptiness. So at each moment, we get to experience that emptiness. Kaya nga, maganda rin yung the way Doc Pao ended it. Na at the end, we go back to that. But at each moment, we get to experience that profound emptiness. And each time must be a time of infinite solemnity. That's why, regardless of the above caution of Nishitani's philosophy, his interpretation of the historical consciousness as grounded in the emptiness of dependent origination is highly insightful, Professor Lin says. With this insight, the illusion of self-centered subjectivism embedded in the modern historical consciousness of the Renaissance, of the Reformation, and the progress of the natural science can be discerned and then transformed to mindfulness of nothingness. For Nishitani, historical existence should be led back to the everyday life world in which, he quotes, flowers cover the mountainsides like brocade, the valley stream deepens into an indigo-like pool. Once again, that push to experience life in total. Okay, so with that, I am quite pleased to say that we have reached the end of the reading, and I think I would say we had a very fruitful discussion. I hope you found it quite insightful too. So thank you, Paul, for your support for this Noche session for this month. Next month, our Noche reading group session would be on Rebecca Klondike. I don't know if that's I forgot her surname, but it's on it's an essay on Saint Thomas Aquinas. So the theme for next month is Thomism as one of the research just. Okay po, so thank you po for coming, and I hope to see you. We hope to have all of you again next month. Thank you po.
Okay, thank you, Anton, and thank you, everybody.
Good night.